Ukraine has had some successes over the past month or a couple of months in targeting Russian bases, targeting the Russian Air Force. They've destroyed some aircraft. There've been a number of successful strikes with, for example, ATACMS on bases in Crimea with submunitions, so cluster munitions. One issue with striking air bases is if you don't have real-time sort of target spotting, so a UAV or a special forces team nearby, or a very, very low latency orbital look, then just knowing there are aircraft on a base and being able to see it on satellite imagery doesn't necessarily tell you where the aircraft are on that base. And so given that most of an airbase is grass and concrete, you can get a fair degree of defense just by dispersal within the base and moving things around as to where you park them and service them fairly regularly and having blast walls between aircraft. Early on in the war, Russia was very sloppy about the way that it deployed, serviced, turned around aircraft. So in early attacks, some of the first attacks on for example, major air bases in Crimea, you saw a significant number of Russian aircraft destroyed thanks to primarily secondary explosions from whatever was used to hit the base. So things like parking aircraft next to each other and refueling them at the same time as you're rearming them, so that if something gets hit, there's a lot of fuel and weaponry just kind of around aircraft. Without blast walls between them necessarily, and having storage for munitions and fuel interspersed along the lines of aircraft. I mean, that kind of really sloppy fieldcraft, for want of a better word. Unfortunately, they have learned a bit. They're still not great, but the Ukrainians have managed to hit some of them. The key thing, I think, is that there is a clear strategy at play to try and force Russian aviation to either require a disproportionate amount of ground-based missile defense, so S-400s, SA-15 Tors, SA-17 Buks, Pantsir, SA-22. In other words, either force them to pull ultimately finite layered air defenses away from other bits of the front line, other potential targets, and concentrate them at air bases relatively near Ukraine, in which case those air bases will probably be pretty difficult to destroy aircraft on, but you'll have denuded a lot of other bits of the front line of parts of coverage, air defense coverage, and therefore Ukraine will have an easier time getting HIMARS strikes and potentially using aircraft near those parts of the front line. Or alternatively, if the Russians choose not to respond to the strikes in that way, they may then have to just stop using those air bases regularly and use air bases that are significantly further away from Ukraine. And that will have an effect in terms of reducing the practical strike rate that the Russian Air Force can conduct. So one of the key problems for Ukraine at the moment is glide bomb attacks from Russian fighter and fighter bomber aircraft. It's generally very difficult to shoot them down, and it's not sustainable to shoot down the bombs themselves. You'd run out of air defense ammunition almost immediately if you tried, because they're used in such numbers. But one of the ways that you can reduce that threat is by attacking Russian air bases and trying to therefore either pull air defenses off elsewhere, in which case at least you have some benefit, or force them to operate much further back, in which case they're going much further each way on each sortie, so each aircraft, each aircrew can actually drop fewer bombs in a given number of time, and you'll increase the wear and tear. So it will functionally reduce the strike rate even without destroying aircraft. And Ukraine has shown an ability to conduct harassing attacks on air bases really quite a long way from Ukraine. So it's clear there's a strategy there, but that strategy is being undermined by the continued prohibition from most Western partners on using long-range Western systems like ATACMS, Storm Shadow, to strike Russian air bases near Ukraine in Russia itself, which is why you've seen most of these attacks being on Russian air bases in occupied Crimea, which we do not recognize as being Russia, because it was illegally annexed. So one of the key things that the West could do quickly to really help the glide bomb situation and give those F-16s more freedom of action potentially over time is to release those permissions holds and allow attacks on Russian air bases in Belgorod and Rostov and other parts of Russia which have air bases which are regularly used for intensive strikes against Ukraine. That would impose more dilemmas on the Russians.
You mentioned earlier, Justin, the importance of moving the F-16s from airbase to airbase to ensure they're protected. Just talk to us a little bit about that, because I mean, even in the last month, we've seen Russia really targeting Ukrainian airfields.
Yes, as you know, the F-16 deployment into country is publicly messaged as getting closer. The Russians have started spending more time attacking Ukrainian air bases than they had for much of the war. While Russia did open the war with significant attacks on Ukrainian air bases, and the Ukrainian Air Force's dispersed operating model really helped them to survive there. And they have periodically attacked some Ukrainian bases, particularly after significant strikes by Ukrainian aircraft throughout the war. The Ukrainian Air Force has not been a primary target for the Russian long-range strike campaign for most of the war, bluntly because the Ukrainian Air Force hasn't been a huge threat to the Russian campaign particularly. It's been an irritation, and it's been something they've had to work around, but it hasn't been their primary target really for much of it. That will change when the F-16s arrive, because there's been so much political hype built up around these aircraft. There's so much symbolism attached to them, and there's so many inflated expectations, bluntly, about what they can achieve, which it's interesting seeing now both sides, and both Ukraine and Western partners, trying to downplay as we get closer. But the Russians will absolutely dedicate a lot more effort to finding and striking the F-16s on the ground than they have previously with Ukrainian aircraft up to now, at least for most of the past 2 years. Also, F-16 requires quite a lot more airfield preparation and maintenance to use sustainably than Ukraine's existing types of aircraft. Smoother, longer surfaces, kept very, very clean. They're sensitive to foreign object debris. It's a lightweight fighter, so that it has the maximum performance within the thrust-weight ratio that they can achieve. But that comes with costs in terms of the surface quality that you need to operate them without high risk of damage. And so Ukraine will have to prepare airfields to a higher standard. That will be quite a visible and quite a personnel-intensive type of activity. And they'll need to do it at quite a lot of locations, which is probably another reason why the initial transfers are likely to be of quite small numbers of F-16s, because even just for relatively small numbers, a squadron's worth maybe, you're looking at having to prepare a lot of and maintain quite a lot of locations to a really high standard to make it so that it's not really easy for the Russians to just work out exactly where they're going to be by looking at, well, which runways have been, had all the cracks filled in or potentially extended, which, where are the unusual patterns of activity, and therefore concentrating orbital and potentially UAV and human intelligence assets to watching them. You'll need a lot of locations. And then even then, they'll probably need a degree of ground-based air defense at the sites as well, to shoot down one-way attack UAVs, cruise missiles, and potentially even ballistic missiles. And of course, it's a bit of a paradox, because one of the reasons why Ukraine desperately wants F-16 in country as soon as possible is to bolster its overstretched ground-based air defenses that are really struggling in terms of coverage and ammunition stocks. But at the same time, bringing F-16s into country will generate a significant additional draw on those limited, overstretched ground-based air defenses, because you'll need to defend them on the ground. But that's not a substitute for dispersal, because any air defenses can be saturated, and the Russians have got very good at saturating them. The key is to provide enough coverage that the Russians have to dedicate quite a significant salvo with quite a bit of planning behind it to have, for example, Shaheds and cruise missiles and ballistic missiles arrive at pretty much the same time from different angles. That takes some planning. And so if you have a bit of ground-based air defense, it kind of raises the thresholds of munitions use, and therefore planning complexity, and therefore time that it takes the Russians to go from detecting that they're at a base to actually striking them, which helps with your dispersal.
It's an old-fashioned technique, but will the Ukrainians be using decoys?
Absolutely, they'll be using decoys. Both sides make extensive use of decoys and have done throughout the war. It's actually one area where not just Ukraine, but actually Russia itself, was way ahead of most Western militaries, even before this war, was in the large-scale production and use of very realistic decoys. They're not just kind of inflatable things. In the Russian case, at least, and the Ukrainian case, it would be fair to suggest they probably do as well. Some of them have, electronics and emitters within them to mimic some of the signals that you would expect certain assets that you're decoying to release, so that they not only appear convincing from visual or potentially infrared inspection, so you have to make them have a heat signature, but also from other forms of observation.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.